Vanessa, you're very kind, and I appreciate your introduction. It was extremely pleasant and very accurate. There is, by the way, a concerto for double bass and viola by Karl Ditters von Dittersdorf. It's not easy for either instrument, and John and I have played it, so we do actually sometimes get our act together musically as well as many other aspects of our work. But I'd like to say a few thanks and reflections, because this is a fellowship that was created in part by my late wife and myself way back when we were working in British Columbia, when I was a teacher, a faculty member of John Fraser University, and my wife was a lecturer and demonstrator in zoology here in UBC. And we spent a wonderful time learning about BC and enjoying this part of the world and doing all the things that people do in BC when you're young and fancy-free, skiing and sailing and walking and enjoying this beautiful countryside, but also being very much involved with the nature of change even in those days. And I was involved with an outfit back in 1969 which was trying to make Vancouver livable and led eventually to the Falls Creek development and all the things which became very much part of the distinctive, more sustainable side of the Vancouver scene. So I was battling away, along with a very distinguished geographer called Walter Hardwick, I'm sure you all remember, who was in City Council at the time, and in many ways used to fire up the City Council in a very delightful and aggressive but very correct way of making sure that the typical political decisions of a City Council were not taken for granted. And good academics with a very sharp mind could make a lot of trouble, and he did. And I was with him in a lot of these activities. So that's my bit. But then money and my money in these early days, I also had the privilege of playing in the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra, and I put the money from that into this fellowship too, created this pool of resource which has led to this particular endowment. So I want to pay tribute to Anne, even though she's not with us, because she's very much part of that. And her legacy and my 2 children and 4 grandchildren are with me in this event. Certainly, I also want to thank very much Mark, Vesey, and the team in Green College, because, frankly, without resurrecting this in the way that you have, there wouldn't necessarily be this very important fellowship. But let's just say what we're going to talk about. I'm going to say a few things about the way I see sustainability and sustainability science evolving, which is setting the scene, as Vanessa very kindly put together, for what this fellowship should be about, or might be about. We're not going to control it. It's up to you guys to work that one out. And then John reflects on the scene in BC, because I'll take a global and a European picture on this. And then I'm going to come back a little bit more in terms of the kinds of challenges of Future Earth will place for research and for learning and for interactive research and working, which is part of the hallmark of UBC. Let's get on with it. There's a conundrum, a massive conundrum, that the world that we're in is somehow losing sight of sustainability. It doesn't seem to understand it, and even if it does understand it, it sees it as some kind of drag on growth. Our Chancellor of the Exchequer regards sustainability as a pain in the backside, because it stops British industry from being competitive. Our Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, won't allow the word sustainability to be mentioned in his department, even though he is meant to be, or his department is meant to be champion of sustainability. He's abolished the Sustainable Development Commission. It no longer exists. There's only one flimsy reed left in Britain speaking for sustainability, and that's the Environment Audit Committee of the House of Commons, chaired by a very tough woman called Joan Wally, and she and I spent a lot of time, I advise her, trying to hold this little lamp alight in these rather dark days. So the first bit of the conundrum is that it's not comprehended, and people don't really, because they don't understand it, they're slightly frightened of it, and if they're not frightened of it, they'd like to dismiss it, and ideally they'd like it somehow to curl up under a rather deep stone and disappear. But the other part of the conundrum, which is the bit we're going to be talking about tonight, is it's not only not disappearing, but it's got more relevance than ever. And I don't need to say that much to you about things like the planetary boundaries and all the things around the big systems, except that science is showing us now, no question about it, writing on the wall. And we in Britain right now have a whole host of flooding events. And these kinds of things are happening on a global basis, a national basis, almost in a regular way. And even in the slightly fuzzy minds of the British politicians, there is beginning to be some link between the massive flooding that's going on, with 2.5 times the average rainfall in the last 3 months, and something called climate change. There's also the beginnings of a sense in business that the world that they think they could rely on, a world of consumerism, a world of continual growth, a world of international foreign markets, and an endless hope for new forms of innovation, are coming up against problems of energy, coming up against problems of resource management, coming up against problems of inequality. The world that we're in is no longer the world that can deliver. And actually, in a curious way, the things that sustainability like to have a go at, terrorism, international economics and transfer flows, and the issues associated with health and security, those things are actually now linked to the issues of what we call a mismanaged planet and a society that's not taking itself rightly in relation to those questions. So the conundrum is actually part of our balance of rethinking, but the challenge for us is that science hasn't quite got its act completely together. Even though it's the most remarkable science there's ever been, there are 4 or 5 areas where science is still reaching out to learn better and do better. One is genuine interdisciplinarity, and I mean by that not just simply the social sciences and the natural sciences coordinating, but even in the sectors of the natural sciences and the sectors of social science, there are cats squealing. They don't seem to fit together. But where we certainly are missing out is on 2 areas that don't really get the same degree of attention. One is the area of what we'll call the creative arts, the imaginative ways in which we can visualize things in a slightly unconstrained fashion. And it's not surprising that many societies in this world, particularly in the developing world, and especially in Africa, but also in East Asia, use the story, use the narrative, use the art form, use the dance form as a means of communicating how they see the world. And you in this country, in this province, but in this country generally, have a wonderful First Nations legacy, which does the same thing. Storytelling is an intrinsic part of understanding the planet and how it has a history and how it has a future. So we need in science to pick up that and make it part of the wonderful, rich heritage of the scientific method. We then also need science to be more ready to accept things that science really doesn't like to discuss. Intuition, empathy, compassion, flexibility, listening, conversing. The interactive process of 2 or more people sharing a learning experience and exploring a journey of transformation. That is the essence of the sustainability phenomenon. We need to teach and express that in a way that we're not doing very well. So that's another challenge that I think science needs to get hold of, and indeed embed it better in the policy process. Because a lot of people will take a view on what they call right and wrong from a number of cues of which science is only a very small part. A lot of it's to do with their social networks, a lot of it's to do with their histories, a lot of it's to do with the way in which they see hope and fear. And I'm very keen, and I'll come back to this at the end, that we need better conversations between younger people and older people, not necessarily that much older, but say roughly people between ages 16 and 25 talking to and listening to people between roughly 35 and 45. Because the first group are the group of the next generation, and the second group are the group that are beginning to show signs of wear and tear. They can't quite see how this world is working out for them. And I think that that kind of conversation took place, and took place across a whole stretch of British Columbia, indeed elsewhere. It would give a very deep insight that what people are looking for are things which we haven't quite got our head around when it comes to science and sustainability. One is, how do we look at long-term implications of what we're doing, 2 or 3 generations away from now? We don't really have a metric for that. And I'll go back to storytelling and so on, but we need to have a much better understanding of who might gain or who might lose from decisions we're taking right now. And that, by the way, relates just to us as individuals. When we take more carbon, or we use more water, or we use more natural resources, or we don't use our waste well, the same kind of thing is happening. We're not really thinking what the implications of that are for the next generation and beyond. So that's an issue. The second one, which I think is more important, is the bit I'd also like to raise, is the sort of moral framing of how we behave. And I actually ran, when I was in Norwich, I was a sheriff of Norwich, and I won't bore you with what the sheriff of Norwich is or was, but it gave me a chance to run a thing called an Independent Climate Change Commission for the City of Norwich. And we had the church involved. We had the dean of the Cathedral of Norwich, and he said to me, Tim, what we need is a moral framework that when people reduce carbon, they should have pride in doing it. They should feel better as citizens. They should actually believe that if a whole street became more carbon reducing, it would be a better street and more connected and more proud of itself than if they just acted alone and kept it quiet. So we should exult in losing our carbon and become part of something which is a different in form of a moral citizen. And I think that is a wonderful concept, and it not just applies to the church, it applies to how we should actually think about the framing of the decisions we take. And I think social psychology, moral framing around how we make decisions and how we behave is the new thinking in sustainability, and it would be a very, very rich area to get involved in, and it's where the interdisciplinarity is not yet fitting. That's one package, and I want to put that to one side. The second package is, for me, the biggest scourge of sustainability is inequality. It's a growing disparity between those who have and who have access to things and those who don't have and don't have access to things. And I'm sure you're familiar with the piece of information that came out from Oxfam only about 2 weeks ago, which said that 85 people, which is less than a full London bus, own as much of the world's resources in terms of wealth as half the world's population, which is 3.6 billion. And when you see that kind of thing in the context of just a London bus full of people, and you realize that those people will always keep on aggregating income, and the 3.6 will become 4.6 in another 30 years if we don't change our ways. What I think people haven't realized is what inequality does to people. It's not that they get bullied or they feel that they are simply rejected. It's actually they lose a sense of being a citizen. They don't have a sense of the longer term. They don't do themselves a lot of good in terms of their health and their well-being and their food and their exercise. So they become ill health, but they also become unemployable. They actually fall by the wayside. And the so-called green economic pattern, the so-called green economy, is more likely to leave these people further by the wayside. So we need to be careful that the greatest danger to sustainability, to watch out, is the fact that deep social inequality and political inequality and the feeling of hopelessness, especially amongst young people. In the European Union, this is a major issue. I'm sure you know the statistics, but on average, 30% of young people are unemployed in Europe. And in some countries, like in Spain, it's over 60%. And we're talking about 2/5, 3/5 of the people between the age of 19 and 25 without any kind of hope of a job at all. So I think the sustainability debate has to turn to new metrics around well-being, around social investment, around mechanisms of making the next generation really part of a nurturing, mentoring, supportive economy. And Vanessa said, what's the prosperity around Future Earth? The prosperity is around creating these new conditions. I would like to see a whole series of sustainability charities formed by raising income from kinds of things like flying. Every time you fly, you should pay a Canadian loonie, as you put it, into the system and create charities from that could create low-carbon living for a poor country. So there's a direct link between flying, if you still want to fly, and some clearly defined benefit to groups of people who wouldn't have it. And it wouldn't come through a government, and it wouldn't even come through an NGO. It would come through a mechanism run by the airline company as a genuine low-carbon charity. Now that kind of thing could be done right across. I wanted in our Norwich study to have £1 on every parking car in Norwich City. That's easy because it's a nice old medieval wall. Anything inside that, if you parked, you paid £1. That would give you a livable city, give you more cycling space, more walking, and so on. But it would come through a charity. It wouldn't come from a public person. It wouldn't come from political interference. It would come from people designing their own way in which their future might evolve. And that self-generating money, creating more opportunity and more money, is something that I think the new sustainability should champion. So I'm going to leave, because I want my twin to say something now before we go into detail on Future Earth and the way in which this fellowship might play out. But I think we've had a fantastic opportunity now to recognize that there's a world out there is beginning to move in this direction. There is a sensitivity in government and elsewhere, even if it's only a distant beat in the back of the head, that things aren't right. The things they want to see settled are not being settled and getting worse. And a lot of this is due to the way we're utilising resources and mismanaging our carbon. But the second part, which is more important, there is a huge opportunity. We rethink the notion of prosperity, we rethink the notion of well-being, we rethink the notion of equality, and we rethink the notion of financing. And these are not impossible things to try out in a place like Vancouver and elsewhere. And I would love to see the Fellowship explore these ideas. Then you can have prosperity which is sustaining, you can have prosperity which is more socially just, and you can have a prosperity which fits within planetary boundaries. And if you ask people, and this is why the conversations I'm arguing for are so important, what they really would like, I bet you most of them would say that. I want a better connected society. I want something that my children can be proud of. I want a future that I know can work, and I want to give people an opportunity to do something which constructs society and removes unnecessary wastage of materials in such a way that they feel proud to be what they're doing. Now that mix is, in my view, the next generation of sustainability. So I'm now going to pass to my twin, and then I'll come back with a bit on Future Earth, and then you can have a go at us, because we're going to be finished by 6, whatever happens.
Thanks very much, Tim. I appreciate your comments, and they've actually acted as a good segue to the talk I want to give. I've been working, as Vanessa said, 35 years in the issues of sustainability across BC. I'm actually only going to talk about one project. I could talk about 15 projects, but I'm going to talk about one, and it's the Great Bear Rainforest, which drapes the central coast from the north end of Vancouver Island to the Prince Rupert and north, and includes Haida Gwaii. And the reason why I'm bringing this to you is that I think it's a uniquely success story of the illustration of points that Tim made. So just put your mind back. In 1998, I was involved in this because I was Deputy Minister for the resource planning on the coast. And so I was directly involved with the Premier and Cabinet Ministers on how we might turn around a situation that was clearly unsustainable. So I'll just talk about some of the features of unsustainability to replicate what Tim was saying. Inequality. The First Nations population, who lived largely on that coast, had 90% unemployment. None of the forest products that were taken from that coast touched their economy. There was top-down government. There was no interaction with the First Nations in terms of how the resource was being used. And the environmental groups were at war in the forest with the forest companies and were blocking the marketing of products on the Central Coast to the retailers in Canada and the States. So there was a breakdown in all facets of sustainability and resource management. The way that was broken was 3 ways. So first off, the forest companies realized that they were in a dead end, that they could not market their conditions without making an overture both to the First Nations and to the environmental groups. So they created what was called a joint solutions project, where outside of the purview of the province, they sat down with the First Nations and sat down with the environmentalists and said, we'd like to work together on a joint solution for how we manage the forestry on this coast in a way that is sustainable. And it took them 4 years of trust building before they had meaningful communications. In 2001, they came to the Premier jointly, forest companies, First Nations, and the environmental community, and said, we've got 2 choices, Premier. We can put $60 million into fighting the war on the woods, which you're never going to win, or we could put $60 million into building a sustainable economy on the Central Coast. Which one do you want? The Premier said, I want the second. I said, how do we get there? Well, we create a plan that is jointly created by the forest companies, environmentalists, government, First Nations, that jointly meets our aspirations. And without going into the long detail, they moved an economy that was top-down dominated, cut and run. There was no long-term logging. It was completely in opposition to environmental standards, to a new-based form of economy which is based on eco-based system logging, on protecting 1/3 of the area in its natural condition, on making First Nations co-decision makers with the government on all aspects of resource management, and on building the First Nations economy in the forest industry so that the resources and revenues flowed directly back to the First Nations economy. The mantra of the First Nations was one job in every household. When we started this project, there was one job in 10 households. Today, there's one job in every household. And the reason for that is because they turned the resource from being a cut and run to a revenue producer. So there are three pieces of revenue that came. First off, the environmental community and the governments put $120 million into a sustainable fund to build an economy on the coast for First Nations. It's the first time that amount of money has been put aside. It's called the Coast Opportunity Fund. The second thing is that the First Nations and the environmental group claimed carbon credits because the forest was then sequestering carbon. And under the forest offset policy of the government, provincial government, they now have sequestered 1 million tons of carbon a year through conservation and ecosystem logging. That 1 million tons of carbon is worth somewhere between $10 and $20 million a year to the First Nations community. And where are they getting it from? They're offsetting the carbon produced by the LNG plants that are proposed for the North Shore. So each one of these LNG plants has to be clean in terms of energy terms. And the only way it can be clean is they offset the carbon they produce by claiming credits against this resource base. So we have now moved from a totally unsustainable situation where there was loggerheads between various factions, total inequality between First Nations and the non-First Nations, to a sustainable funded economy, not only based on carbon credits from the forest industry, but they've used the money from the Coast Opportunity Fund to create a sustainable shellfish industry, sustainable outdoor recreation industry, and renewable energy in terms of run-of-the-river projects and wind farms. So the entire economy of that central and north coast is now in transition from the old style of non-renewable resources to one entirely based on natural resources. So I will come back and tell you in a few minutes what were the 5 winning conditions that made that transition possible.
We're doing well for time, but I now want to pause a little bit and say something about Future Earth, which is probably not known to many of you, though I know Vanessa is very much involved in it. The concept in Future Earth comes from an effort that was done by the international science community that led up to the famous first Rio conference in 1992. And in that, what was then known as the International Council of Scientific Unions, ICSU, based in Paris, teamed up with a number of other organizations, including the International Social Science Council, to try and get essentially an interdisciplinary approach to the science of global change. And that actually, I was much involved with that. I had 3 years of involvement in that, in the European side of things. And we got involved with the European Science Foundation and a number of other organizations, but basically coming right down to it didn't work. And the initiative rather fell to the ground. But what came out of it were a series of major global science initiatives, of which 4 are well known to you, I'm sure. One is the International Geosphere and Biosphere Programme, which is essentially the big program around ice and oceans. Second one is the World Climate Research Programme, which is, of course, the one that created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The third one is Diversitas, which is a global program on biodiversity and land use. And the fourth one is the International Human Dimensions Programme, which is around the social sciences of essentially development and environmental change. All of these are essentially large global research programs, but they don't really talk to each other, and they don't have a really powerful outreach to the world of business and stakeholders generally, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and to community organizations. In fact, most people have hardly heard of these things, except from time to time they pronounce on acidification of the ocean or whatever. So in leading up to the conference 20 years later, the so-called Rio Plus 20, which took place in Rio last June, the same group of people organized a new Future Earth initiative. That does bring together what is now known as the International Council for Science, which are the big academies of science globally. The Royal Society in the United Kingdom, American US Academy of Sciences, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and so on. So they're the big global science communities. And then we brought in the International Social Science Council, again based in Paris, and that involved the big academies of the social sciences, again mostly called social science academies, though in the United Kingdom it's called the British Academy. And I happen to be honoured as a fellow of the British Academy, and I'm leading the BA put into this operation. But on top of that, there's new initiative, there's funding coming in from the Belmont Forum, which is a big funding operation, global. And there's big support from the United Nations University, and there's big support from the UN generally, and so on. So this has become a significant player. And is rubbing up against the major conventions, the International Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Desertification, the Convention on Biodiversity, and so on. And the idea behind Future Earth is to start essentially three things. One is, what is actually going on with this planet, the so-called dynamic planet, from a completely integrated perspective? Not just in terms of natural systems, but the way human beings are interfering with those natural systems, the so-called Anthropocene. And I think for the first time there will be a direct link between something like acidification of oceans and what we are doing to add to that. But at the same time, there's no reason why you couldn't have a study of the acidification of the oceans and what we should be doing to reduce them. And a good example of this is the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If you read these, it has two graphs, one of a chart for temperature for the year 2100, which in parenthesis is long before grandchildren being born today will die. So we forget that beyond 2100 there's a lot of life, and it's actually life that we are creating. But also had stuff on sea level rise, and both of those are big gaps. In the climate temperature case, it's between 1.5 degrees and 6.8 degrees, and in sea level rise is between about 23 centimetres and roughly a metre. The reason why these gaps are there, not, I hasten to add, because the scientists don't know, is because they input what would happen if we changed our carbon habits on a sequential basis between now and 2050. So this is the beginning of what Future Earth is trying to say. If we stop doing these things, these are the consequences. If we don't stop doing these things, these may be the consequences. Now, I don't want to put this in the context of fear. I want to put this in the context of revelation. And here's an opportunity for us to rethink. If I do this and I do that, but we do it on a collective basis rather than individual basis, with working small, and it only gives you small outcomes. But working collectively with a wrong push, you can see real gains, and gains that can mean something to people that you're giving life to in the next 10 years. That kind of thing is where Future Earth is onto. That's number one. So it's the science of the planet with the science of human interaction in the planet connected together. That's not been done on the scale of these big international programs so far. So that's why I think Future Earth has what I call great value. The second thing is looking at the whole question of development. How should we develop? And what are the kinds of challenges facing China or Asia or India or Africa, or even indeed this country? What kinds of developmental patterns should we be putting into effect to take away from those likely outcomes which are damaging? And here we're getting the things I touched on earlier, but I want to say a few more things about. For example, there's a transition movement all over the place now, where groups are beginning to form to start thinking differently about how they live, how they relate to each other, and how they give rise to a learning process for others to follow. And I'm very much involved with a lot of work called the Transitions to Sustainability movement in the European context, because that is actually beginning to have quite a degree of legitimacy. About a quarter of the total population is now in some form or other engaged in this kind of activity. They are trying to get away from a world which is closing them down. So the second part of this is actually studying the experimental, very sensitive, very beginnings of a new journey, a new set of companionships between people on the planet that we haven't quite got to. And I'll use the word companionship rather than partnership, because companionships mean that people are locked together in reciprocal requirements of obligation. Again, something that the First Nations people here place high on their agenda. So when you do something, you have a responsibility to think what that might mean to somebody else, not just do it. And I think the same happens with reciprocity. Reciprocity means that things go wrong for you, someone will come in and support you. And you do something for someone else. But in both cases, it's not based upon any sense of obligation or conditionality. And this notion of unconditional sharing is another bit of the Future Earth journey. How can we get societies to exalt in that, believe that that is part of the joy of a society which is coming closer to the planet? And I think that's a major issue. I want to come finally into that in a second. And the third part of this wonderful triage of Future Earth is this loose, often overused phrase, governance. But what governance is about is not about governing, it's about changing the way we relate to each other. It's about giving people hope when they have despair. It's recognizing that saving something that would otherwise be damaging is an act not just of charity, but of actually tremendously important public saving. So we're beginning to get the idea that social investment, that is investing in people who are doing creative things and giving them room for maneuver, and recognizing that that is a legitimate income, is actually something that we need to redesign. And the model of the emerging economy is a model of what's sometimes called beyond GDP and based upon well-being and betterment. And those are immensely important things, but they don't have measures. And so one of the challenges, I think, for this fellowship would be, how do we measure this? How do we get some handle that this is actually a better world? How can we show to people, and how can they show to us that what they're doing is giving them not only a sense of courage, which is really important, but a sense of destiny, that where they're going to is worthwhile. So I'm urging us to begin to think that in governance is not a matter of governance, it's about the soul, it's about the sense of where you are in relation to a changing world, and it's the capacity to be tough and resilient even when people think you're nutters. And I think the most important part of any new fellowship is to be able to say, no, I'm not a nutter, but why don't we engage in why I don't think I am, and why just in the back of my mind I might think you are. So that's what I'm going to, but then what does this mean for learning? And I see in UBC, because I saw a chart on John Robinson's wall which gave me great hope, that the teaching and learning side of UBC is now being revitalized by something called the sustainability transition. And I have to say, we in the European scene are doing the same thing. And we have this great anticipation now that across all campuses, within the next 2 to 3 years, there will be a sustainability drive that will become embedded in all aspects of learning. Now that is picking up what we've just been talking about, so I'm not going to repeat all that. But what comes out of it are really some very exciting things about methods of learning that I want to share with you. The first one is for all students to have a highly critical willingness and in fact ability never to take things on face value. Because what you're getting from the world out there is distorted. Not only distorted, but it's almost certainly distorted in order to manipulate the way you think. In the jargon of politics, it's called third dimension power. In the jargon of psychology, it's called cognitive dissonance. It's a very dangerous area that we're all in, that you can actually believe doing something is right by doing something which is wrong. So one of the nice things about new forms of learning is to have that critical assessment is, why am I getting this information in this way? Who's giving it to me? Why is it in this form? What should I be doing about it? And how can I transform that information in another way that makes sense to somebody who's on the sustainability transition? So what we call critical awareness, the jargon word is reflexivity, but I'm trying to use, now you retire, you forget the jargon. It's good for you to forget the jargon. But it is part of what I'm learning. The second thing is co-learning, that nobody should be learning on their own. I would like to see a PhD, maybe eventually this wonderful fellowship could be a joint PhD between somebody in a university setting and somebody not in a university setting, someone in business, someone in government, someone in civil society, someone in a community, who are going through a journey and writing it up. So the method of the PhD is not a black book with gold letter on it, but actually a diary, a visual diary, a story diary, an e-diary a series of conversations. Why can't we have that as part of learning? Very rich, very open-ended, very challenging. And then I'll go further, and I think that we might even have in this world of learning what we call ambassadorships, where every student ought to be able to go out into the world and start talking to a world that doesn't necessarily want to listen right away. Now, we have a real battle inside the University of East Anglia between what's called the employability drive and the sustainability drive. The employability drive is, get a job. You don't care where you get a job, get a job. What happens if you go into Chevron or into Shell and you're mucking about with fracking, which is a highly difficult issue in Britain right now, or EDF, which is the French company trying to build nuclear stations in the United Kingdom? What should you do? Should you take a job there? Now, you can't say to a young graduate, don't go in there. What you can say to a young graduate is, go in there, but start talking the language of the sustainability transition. Understand how these people think, why they think, what can you do to start that process of reassessment. So the ambassadorship, in my view, should be an intrinsic part of graduation. I'll leave one other comment, because we're also working on this, which you might want to think about in UBC. We're going to think of what's called a graduate passport. And the passport contains that you have done not just all your marks and credits and assignments, but actually you've become a leader. You've shown you've become a leader. You've become an ambassador. You've shown you've become an ambassador. You've become someone with very considerable skills of communication. You've shown you've got those skills. You're somebody who's extremely versatile in areas where you don't any longer have familiarity. You're trying to measure something and you haven't got any track record, which is commonplace in sustainability. Ecosystems evaluation is not an easy area to measure. And betterment, as I said earlier, or well-being are not easy areas to measure. But if you can show you made a contribution, understand that on your passport. And I would like to see UBC champion the idea of a student graduate passport, doesn't matter what level, undergraduate, postgraduate, you're all in this room wonderfully represented, who actually might be able to say, look, it is not just about learning about a discipline or even a multiple discipline. It's about the capacity to be the transformational element that can make the society a better place. And I can understand that and be part of that transformation. Now that, to me, is the great challenge for future Earth. If we can get that far, we can go a long way. But I can assure you that right now I'm struggling with very considerable forces of darkness. And they are the science community that doesn't want to get too involved with social sciences because they think they're ill-disciplined and sometimes dangerous. You have a situation where people don't want to get too close to business because they think they're going to take you over. You have people who are very dispirited about politicians and think they are simply unwilling to listen. And you have, most of all, a great sense in the university, not here in UBC, I'm glad to say, where this notion is a bit too far to go. Now, I don't think any of that needs to last for long. And all I would like to say, and then we have a discussion on this, that I'm learning from by being here for 2 weeks, which feels like 5 years, and I'm thoroughly happy to have been here for so long a time in my mindset, even though it was short in days, that really there is a fantastic opportunity here in UBC and in this college for you to grasp the messages that my brother and I are giving you. And I had a nice session with John's class yesterday, and I felt very heartened by the intelligence and the insight and the wisdom and the wit coming from the students of British Columbia. So I feel that we've got now this momentum. It really is there for us to grasp. For heaven's sake, let's go for it.
I just want to make a few concluding comments from my point of view, leading first off to the Great Bay Rainforest and then to another project I'm working on. The first lesson I learned, and it comes back to Tim's comments about ambassadorship and student passports and ability to bring people together. As mentioned, in 2000, there are 4 levels of governance in my mind. One level is the public sector, the established government, provincial government, local government, federal government. Then there's the private sector, business, forestry, mining, the oil and gas industry. The third level of government is what I call civic sector, the NGOs, the average person in the street, the communities that get engaged in issues. And the fourth the group, which by no means least is First Nations. They were all at war in 2000. In 2008, they all came together. There was no way that the sustainability transition on the Central Coast could possibly have happened unless all four levels of governance had aligned themselves. And they did that through the kind of thing that Tim was talking about, people seeing the big picture when they were working in the small picture, and people who were willing to give a little bit in order to meet the interests of other parties. It took a long time, but we needed that skill of ambassadorship, of communications, of science, and of learning. The other big challenge that I'm working on, I just want to leave this for it. I think it is an important part of the research curriculum for this fellowship. I'm very privileged to be working with a team at Simon Fraser called ACT, which is Adaptation to Climate Change Team. I won't go into the details of this group, other to say that we all believe that the climate is changing, a combination of natural and man-made forces, and it's not going to be possible to reverse this trend, so we have to get serious about adapting to a changing climate. The work that's being done now is a very fruitful area for student research, and it's the nexus between food, water, energy, and biodiversity. These are biodiversity. So we have a combination of a growing carbon, changing climate, and a reduced capacity for the Earth to absorb the shocks because of the loss of biodiversity. So we have to reverse this to make the systems more resilient. A whole lot of ways, both naturally and in an infrastructure and community design. So there's, if you start to think that in the next 20 or 30 years there'll be a 50% increase in energy use, a 50% increase in water, a 50% decrease in biodiversity, and a 50% increase in food. And we know we've got real problems. So the nexus of integrating these four fields into a more resilient, adaptive set of systems is a fundamentally important area of research, and I would encourage that to be on the table for the folks who are engaging in the next steps with this fellowship. But thank you very much for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you.
Great. Well, it was wonderful to hear from both Tim and John about how relevant sustainability is. Even if some of us are walking away from it, they're actually, in the comments they made, shaping some of the ways in which we can actually look at this with fresh eyes. And I think what really struck me is the kind of, let's bring in things like the creative arts, moral framing, our spirit and our soul, that kind of aspect. We need to look fundamentally at inequality, which I think all of us are struggling with. How do we handle the gross inequities currently in the world, and what that means for issues of governance? What it means for how we're going to deal with resilience in terms of integrating these different groups. It brings us to revisiting finance, prosperity, well-being, and some of the examples in terms of carbon credits and the First Nations Coast Opportunity Fund, but also what Tim said about social investment not being charity, but being fundamental to investment into our future. And I think what's most important is that they both really spoke to this, the need for better conversations. And in John's case, we saw that with the Great Bear Rainforest, the coming together of very divergent groups led to a shift in sustainability. In Tim's case, with Future Earth, we're still, the question's still out. Can we have a better conversation across these different scientific communities to provide us with the insights we need at that global scale? And at UBC, I think things are very much happening. And so how can this fellowship keep us going in terms of this critical thinking, this empathy, this collective companionship as we move towards sustainability? So those are the things that really struck me about what Tim and John were putting on the table for this fellowship and for our conversation tonight. I'm going to invite both of them to come up, and we're going to go into a period of discussion and dialogue, and I look forward to your comments. I've also been asked by Tim, I'm going to run out to the side at one point and take a photo, so if you're seeing me doing that, that's what I'm doing. But I'll bring Tim and John both up, and I'll ask them also to speak into the microphone when you're answering the questions, because we're on film. Yes. And we'll repeat the questions back. So I'll do that part, and then I'll hand it over to Tim and John. So I'm looking to you. Who would like to begin with some comment? Yes, sir, at the back.
I'm wondering if you could speak to sustainability, equality with population want to do it from Canada, she's in Canada as an example. With all the tanker traffic that could possibly come in the future, and the population growth on the planet, it seems, I don't know, if you give some ideas on where you think that's going to go and how we can deal with that.
Great. So the question was about what happens with some of these success stories like the Great Bear Rainforest in light of global population growth, and in fact, how do we take those kinds of changing dynamics into account? So I'll first turn it to John, and then we'll hear from Tim on his perspective. John, if you can speak to that.
I think one of the, I said that I would talk about 5 winning conditions. I ran out of time to give you the winning conditions, so I'll give you them in my answers. One of the winning conditions is the legal embedding of the way the resources were managed, and so that when the First Nations and the NGO community put $60 million on the table, they did it with conditions, and the conditions were that the government would be committed to maintaining in perpetuity the fabric of the land use plan that they created. So they asked for it to be put into law. They didn't trust Cabinet to do it by Cabinet order. They wanted a law. That meant it had to go back to the legislature and debate it in public. That was a primary condition which would allow this fabric that's on the landscape now to mature and stay for maturity, no matter what level of population growth might take place. So it's embedded in law. It's a fundamental condition for that.
I'm going to have more questions, but just very quickly, because I think you all know the answer, is that there is virtually no incompatibility between a genuine sustainability transition and lower fertility. All the studies show that where you have the conditions that would meet what we call sustainability, you have lower fertility. The one area which is still unclear is around consumption, because you can actually get increased consumption with lower fertility, so that the net result is a bit ambiguous. And I do think that takes us back to the other question we raised. But in general, we want to lower the numbers of people on the planet, going the route that we're talking about, equality, better treatment of women, more opportunities for education, all the things you know about. Those things do systematically change the fertility levels of many, many parts of the world very rapidly. But the one gap which needs to be addressed is that a higher income and lower fertility country tends to have higher consumption rates, and they're often quite demanding on the planet. So that's a bit, I'm afraid, I haven't got an answer for in a short answer, but when we go into a breakout session further on, I'll come into more detail, because I don't want to take another lecture time for you all.
Great. And actually, that's a lot of what One Earth does. We're looking at the consumption and production rates globally. So if you're interested in that, come speak to me, because that's what we're really looking at. So, great. Yes, sir.
I'd like to go back to the Great Bear Forest, and it's a success story, clearly, and admirable. I'd like to ask you to speak to whether or not you can see examples of where the learning there has gone from the coast to the interior. And specifically thinking of Port Simpson and Aqualamps, and the beginning of when I was there some time ago, what seemed to be the major success was the selective logging, and then the control taken by the Tsimshian tribe in that area. Has that sort of learning and those techniques, the legislation and all of the other things you talked about, has that gone to the forest industry and the rest of BC?
So the question was really about whether these lessons from the Great Bear Rainforest actually translated into other parts of the interior of BC, and particularly around selective logging or First Nations involvement, and perhaps the legislation as well. So over to you, John.
The short answer is not yet. It hasn't shifted from the coast to other parts of BC. The longer answer is that the ecosystem-based logging is actually a simple concept. If you were flying over the Great Bear Rainforest in 1500, it would be disturbed. There's a natural disturbance pattern. There would be some fires, there'd be some windfall, there'd be some beetle kill, pestilence. So there isn't, the forest changes over time naturally. The idea of ecosystem-based logging was to replicate what nature did to the forest by allowing human intervention to be on the same scale. It's basically all it did. So it allowed for trees to be cut, but it also allowed for trees to stand, and the value of trees standing was higher than the value of trees cut. That was the lesson learned about ecosystem-based logging. the science that's being undertaken in the last 5 years has gradually understood how the balance of that ecosystem-based logging can be replicated into a sustainable well-being, i.e. jobs for the community. Once that is learned, that balance is learned, I think it'll start to shift to other parts of the province. But the agreement was that there would be a learning laboratory for 10 years, which was studied in 2005, so we're close to the end of that period, and then we'll see how it might transition to other parts of the province.
Yes.
Yeah, so am I to understand that the so-called sustainable economy in Great Bear Rainforest is being financed by the fracking industry in the Peace River Company through carbon offsets?
So is the Great Bear Rainforest being financed actually by activities such as fracking or other things going on? And is that the way that we keep economic development there? So, John?
Good question. You want to always give a good question. It gives you 2 minutes to find out the answer. Rightly or wrongly, the government's policy today is that if there's an increment, a genuine increment of carbon capture that wouldn't take place under normal conditions, it is banked for an offset for something that inevitably requires carbon to be created. So the carbon offsetters that James Tansey is doing is looking at that balance. So that the idea is it has to be something that's incrementally more in terms of reducing carbon emissions. And it is available in the market for offsetting for activities that can't avoid creating more carbon. So that's basically what is going on in the Great Bear Rainforest. If you're asking me morally whether this is good policy, I personally have my doubts. But it is government policy, and the First Nations are taking advantage of it, and it is contributing to a much better welfare for them than would otherwise be the case.
I've got some questions if you don't. Yes, okay, good.
This isn't so much a question as amusing. If I'm having it, I'm assuming maybe some other people are. I found both talks great, and I admire both gentlemen have for a long time. But I guess it's my own cognitive dissonance here. The rural carper regime seems to be just whited out of the picture. The branch plan of Victoria seems to be whited out of the picture. The fact that Western Canada in general has kind of become the heart of darkness when we talk about sustainability issues in general and climate change issues in particular just doesn't figure in this discussion yet. I'm trying to figure out, sitting here, University of British Columbia, focused on what's going on in Western Canada, presumably. What am I missing? How come all the other stuff doesn't fit into it? Where did it go?
So basically the question is about considering our current context. Yeah.
The reality that's taking place, so we've got some of the world's worst mining companies, definitely the world's worst hydrocarbon companies in Northern Alberta, and so on and so forth. And they're the ones that are driving the local economy and driving the political agenda.
Right.
Both, not municipally, thank God, every place, but provincially and federally. And they trump the municipalities in most cases.
So how do we think about these things in the context of the Western political and our federal context? Yeah, Tim.
I'm going to answer this not on the famous Canadian case. I'll leave John to it, but I have my own views on that, but I'll keep them quiet. But I think what is actually interesting about your question, which is really what we have to address, is first of all that a critical assessment of the way things are being done is no bad thing. That's what universities stand for, and if we work out the ambassadorship program I'm talking about, and I do say to you that the hearts and minds are not so antagonistic as you think they are. There is scope for some kind of change which is outside what you might call normal politics. Having said that, there's never question that there is what's going on in the United Kingdom right now with a government which claims to be the greenest ever and is about as brown as you can get, is that there is in fact a real stifling of the way science is treated. And I understand some of what's going on in British Columbia. I'd like to raise this with the general discussion amongst you. And I did see a statistic in the Watershed conference in last week that 57% of government scientists in Canada feel they can't speak the truth. Now, if that's a situation for government scientists it certainly is a very dangerous area to get into, and I think we should be addressing this kind of thing more systematically. For what it's worth, the Environment Agency in the United Kingdom, which is our main environmental protection organisation, they're not allowed by government rule to say anything about policy. So you can have an Environment Agency man saying, or woman, saying, here's your flood risk, but you can't say what should be done about it, which is an extraordinary thing to do in terms of the way in which, what we're talking about. So my argument is we need a systematic engagement and a systematic analysis of this kind of thing, and constantly keep at it. That this needs to be spelt out, and at least where there's still a last bastion of openness of speech, you say these are the things that need to go in, and I honestly believe that there are people out there that are beginning to resonate with this kind of thing. My other, I'm afraid to say, thing is that sometimes governments have to be shocked into listening. And we have this situation in England right now where people who are wealthy are being flooded, and for the first time the squealers are the people who think they get everything their way and they don't have to worry about anything. Now they're actually getting hammered by the very thing they're creating, which is a climate change world. I think there's no bad thing at all from time to time. I said this to John's class yesterday, that having what you might call pain against people who are really needing to be frightened and sharpened up is part of the political process of awareness raising. What we need to do is use these opportunities to say, why do you allow this to happen? You're a politician, you're a Democrat, you're supposed to listen, you're supposed to care about the next generation. Here are signals. Why do you allow this to happen? So part of what I call the ambassadorship role is actually raising the agenda so it cannot be ignored, even by politicians. And then slowly, and it won't happen overnight, that power shift will start to take place. Because underneath this all, people are getting frightened that the things they believe in, wealth and peace and quiet and lack of any hustle and non-cohesive communities, big things in Europe, I can tell you, big things in Europe, they're beginning to come home to roost. And politicians realise they've got to do something about the development process. Otherwise this cannot be allowed to continue. So you've got to capture a mood of anxiety and make it a mood of hope.
Great, thanks Tim. John?
Well, my comment is you're not missing anything. You're absolutely right. What I tried to give was a little shaft of light on sustainability that I've been proud to be part of that is quite different from everything else I've witnessed in government. And it's just that what you're seeing in the tar sands and other parts of BC is still in the darknesses. But the interesting thing is that the First Nations in North, the coastal First Nations, who are the primary First Nations in the North Coast involved with the Great Barrier Rainforest and who had developed this collegial and working relationship with the provincial government, the NGOs, and with industry, in this case the forest industry and the tourism industry, completely at loggerheads with the federal government, who is pushing the Northern Gateway project. And that, to my way of thinking, is one of the reasons why that project will likely never be built. It's actually going through the Great Barrier Rainforest, and it's just not going to happen. So, and part of that reason is because of that relationship was never developed between the federal government and the people who saw themselves on the land.
Great. Yeah, John?
John, I want to ask a question about a science-based agenda, because that's the kind of language that you're both using. My experience with IHDP and IGBP, as it then was that part of the reason why these global research programs could never get together was the complete colonization of the agenda from the scientific community and the inability for social science to get a significant place at the table. And the interesting thing was there was this kind of attitude, which I hear a little flavor of, I think, in what you're saying tonight, that we found out the facts, and now we have to find a way to communicate them better. And we, the natural scientists, aren't very good at communicating, so let's use the social scientists to be our communicators. But that didn't work very well, so now we'll turn to the artists, and they'll be our communicators. And I'd like to suggest that most artists aren't really interested in being Soviet realist painters, and that propaganda is not the role that they see themselves as playing in the world. And so I want to quote you a PhD student of mine that I mentioned to Tim at lunch, but John, you haven't heard. David Maggs, whom Vanessa knows, who said, maybe the challenge of sustainability isn't to prove the world more real. We've tried rubbing people's noses in the facts of the matter for decades, to not much avail. maybe the challenge of sustainability is to prove the world more imaginary. And really we're trying to create something that doesn't exist. And so it's not about science communication. It's not about endless public lectures on climate change and the carbon sinks and the cloud physics. And on, this kind of constant program of trying to beat people over the head with the so-called facts of the matter. Maybe it's actually about engaging people in quite different terms. For example, aesthetically. What kind of world do we want to live in is a normative ethical question. It's not a scientific question at all. Science has a role to play, obviously, in telling us things. But I'm wondering if the way we frame the whole thing might be thought of a little differently. And I think that's compatible with a bit of what you're both saying, but I also hear the shades of the other ones. I'm just wondering what you think of that.
So, yeah.
Is the challenge of sustainability to kind of convey the facts to ignorant people who don't understand what a serious problem it is, or is it to engage them in quite different ways?
Okay, so basically you're asking about the science agenda part of this, and is the challenge to convey the facts or actually engage people in a much more, either an aesthetic way or a different way, so that we're looking at both science and social science and the arts from that perspective. So Tim, do you want to speak to that?
I'm fully aware of what you're saying, John, but I don't think I was actually making in my speech much of a pitch for what you call the empty vessel philosophy, where you just open up a person's head and pour facts in. What I was actually saying was something, I distinguish between what's called the critical friend, which is why scientists and politicians love to see the social sciences. We have a big problem in Britain with radioactive waste disposal of high-level waste, the most potent waste. We have another big problem with fracking, as you know. And the government can't stand it, that these people are standing around blocking what they see as a perfectly sensible energy development called fracking. So the answer to what the government says to social science is, why can't you find a way of getting these people off our backs? And the answer is, because you're asking the wrong question. Now, what we're now arguing for, now I've been arguing for many years, and you know this, my friend, so I don't try and paint a brush on my head, which is not there. The answer is that we should be friendly critics, that we should be saying, what is the wrong, what is about the process in which you're making a decision, which is going to lead you to this outcome? And then change the way we address the way in which you analyse decisions. So I'm actually working with the British Academy on redesigning how policy is made so that these questions with social sciences and with the humanities are right in the frame and not left to one side when the going gets tough. So I'm going to start by that. The other one is we discussed earlier, and I will say a bit more about this idea of unfolding conversations, which I really think is important, and John touched on it, and I'm doing the same thing in the UK. The most interesting thing about this twin and I do the same thing every second of every day. I can't explain, I wouldn't bore you with the details, but I can assure you, when he breathes, I breathe. But same with this fellow over here, John Robinson. His ideas are very close to mine. We're 9,000 kilometres apart, we don't communicate, but it doesn't make a scrap of difference. We are doing exactly what you're trying to do, getting people to imagine a better world, getting people to realise that they're talking to the next generation who also want a better world, and realise that the world they're stuck in isn't going to give them that. So how do you get a dialogue to make sense? Now, I really urge you in British Columbia to try this out. And you don't have to do it with sitting down round a table. We're talking about, for example, walking and talking to each other, going to some interesting place and talking to each other, breaking the mould of the typical interview, changing the whole model of the interview. So it's not an interview, it's a conversation. And conversations are an art form we're almost losing, where you're listening and responding and creating and learning all the time. So at the end of any conversation, you should be more informed and better appreciating, not just the topic, but also why the people are changing the way they're doing. If we started that creative act and brought that into learning generally, in all aspects of university life and elsewhere, it would start that process of releasing what is the biggest danger we've got of framing ourselves into some kind of fixed outcome. I'm thinking this way because that's the way I've always been taught to think, or that's the way my agency or government body or job or household or whatever it is makes me think. Why don't we break that open? Makes it much more flexible to give people a chance to unhook and unfold. So that's your stuff. We need to get this going.
No, very briefly, one of the areas I'm working on is in watershed governance, and I'm working closely with the Shawnigan group because they are actually trying to bring civic governance to watersheds. One of the innovations they're doing is engaging Shawnigan Lake School in a program called Reflecting Water, where they're asking the students to provide art as a medium of expressing the values that they see in water. So this is the first time that we've actually studied to bring art as a substantive support to science and both social and natural sciences. So we'll see how that goes.
Great. So I see you, and then over to you. And we've got about 10 minutes just so people know what the time.
I have a couple of questions in there.
Oh, yeah, let's do 2 in a row, and then we'll respond to both. Go ahead. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yes, you, yes, sorry.
Don't have as much of a knowledge background in terms of how to tackle the questions. So I would like to know if you guys can give one piece of advice, the most important piece of advice to young adults that would like to change the road to kind of get into this issue, but kind of don't have the tools yet. So what's the most important mindset they should have to be able to change the road to make the world more sustainable?
Great question. Yes.
Thank you for such eloquent talks. I really enjoyed them. My question also is about science. Tim, you mentioned that it might be useful for us to move away from the traditional framework of the scientific methods, one that involves storytelling, empathy, intuition. And while I would certainly agree that I think that's very important for scientists to move towards, perhaps in their explanation of science through story, or in using intuition and empathy to figure out what exactly to study or how to study it. I'm not sure what science would look like itself if we were to adopt this methodology. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Great. Actually, let's see if there's any, because I'll see if there's one last question, and then, yeah, sir, and then that'll be the questions, but then we'll go into Tim and John's conversation.
What are your thoughts on the TPP trade agreement that's coming across or being developed?
Sorry, can you say it again?
The Trans-Pacific trade agreement that's being developed.
Great. And what's your question? Just to want them to comment their thoughts on it? Okay. Great. So I think I'm going to hold yours as the last question. And so we'll start with the narrative question. So the question was really around, with science, if we're if we're moving away from the traditional form of science, looking at empathy, intuition, and narratives, you can see how it relates to perhaps communication of science, about exploring what to study, but what are the implications for the scientific field. So I'll hand that over to Tim, and then if John wants to comment about that first.
We're great believers in this future Earth transformation, what's called cooperative science. It's very important to make clear that whatever science is done, it's only a partial way of generating knowledge. And what does the word scientas mean? The basic Greek word means knowledge, knowing, a form of understanding. It's not about a particular method of study. So, for example, if people don't believe you in the area of climate change, and don't believe the model, say, of coastal change, which I do a lot of work on in Portugal and the United Kingdom, you can't get the scientists to tell you what the sea level will be like in 2080. They won't be able to tell you, frankly, for all the reasons I've mentioned. But what they can say is there may well be changes, and we should discuss how these changes might be. So the narrative becomes a way of engaging the conversation of the scientists and saying, well, we could probably design this coast differently. But if we do, we need to have a lot of discussion as to what happens with roads and infrastructure and planning so that we have some kind of agreement on that. I can assure you, working as I've done in both Portugal and North Norfolk, it is much more difficult to move a society back from the coast than you think it is. So the way to do it is to get confidence around the co-learning of the two ways in which you look at information, because a lot of the science is actually very uncertain and highly indeterminate, but it becomes much more relevant if people can engage with it and come up with their own ways of responding. So I'm urging us to think of science as a cooperative dialogue. And I'm not taking anything away from what you're saying, but there's a point where the scientist is necessary to give you some kind of underpinning for likely outcomes, but where also the community is necessary to give you confidence that you can share their way of responding. So that's how we can put these two together. Well, there was another question?
No, they'll come back to the trade one in a second. Yeah.
I wanted to come back to your question about what's the biggest point, at least I've learned, in terms of the way people are thinking to shift towards sustainability, and that's the concept of integrative thinking, being able to look at the whole picture when you're looking at the parts. If you only look at the parts, you'll get it wrong. If you somehow or other can put in your mind how the whole picture fits together, and then go down to the parts to do some tinkering to get a better understanding of how it works, but always thinking back to the big picture, then you're likely to get it right. I'll just give you another one example from the work I did on the coastal forests. There was an interest by the tourist industry to keep an intact viewscape for all the cruise ships that go from Vancouver to Alaska, so that they didn't see clear cuts on the way up to Alaska. So a lot of work was done to look at the way the forest would look from boats, GIS and GPS and all that kind of stuff. But that wasn't done only with one item in mind, which is viewscapes. What the integrative thinkers did, started to say, well, how will we also place the forest, protect grizzly bear migration corridors? How do we protect riparian zones for fish? How do we maintain seed capacity for other parts of the rainforest so that they mature in the same way? So there was a whole series of integrative ways that changed the shape of that forest, but used the idea of intact viewscapes as the driver. And the combination of these thinking was a much more powerful statement on the land than just simply doing the one thing of protecting viewscapes.
John, I'm going to keep you up here because we've got a question on the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement and what you think are the implications for things that you were speaking to. So if you wanted to speak to that as well.
Well, I have the difficulty that I don't know very much about the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, so I would be speaking in ignorance about the specifics. But what I can say is that from what I do know, it's a commercial agreement which is geared towards consumerism, increased trade for increasing income, and very little attention to environmental and social issues. In my mind, the new trade agreements that we have to create over the coming decades is one where there's actually a comparable vision of sustainability, of carbon footprints, of resilient ecosystems, and that we don't trade with countries that don't have a similar set of values relating to the combination of ecosystem management, social justice, and a well-being base. So I think it's off on a side tangent. It needs to be brought back to centre.
Right.
Is this are you now closing down?
I could, but do you want to say something?
I'd like to say
do you want
something.
No, I'm going to actually bring up her question right now because I just need to say it for the camera. So basically, your question was around, for those of everyone in the room who doesn't have the science tools but still wants to know what is the best mindset to bring and perhaps best attitude or ways of working that can lead to sustainability, what would that be? We've already heard John say that an integrated perspective, seeing the whole as well as the parts, is a key part. I will, if you have something you want to add to that, you can, and I'll hand it over to Tim to answer your question.
Is this the last word?
Yeah, it is the last word. Go for it. This is the moment, Tim.
He's about to leave the province.
You can also have the last word.
The single word I'll give you is confidence. Every time you have a conversation about sustainability, by definition, you're dealing with people whose world is non-sustainable. They think, they act, they perceive non-sustainably. That's why we are. We've a world of non-sustainable players, very good at it, become expert at it. So the world that you are going to move into, and the world we're encouraging you to do, is have the confidence to understand why that world is like what it is, and how it can be changed, and to stand up to the argument when someone says, you're silly. You're saying things which can't possibly work. Stand up to that and say, I'd like to engage in that in a slightly different way so we can see we can go forward. Never give way on that particular ground, because that's the firm ground of your generation. That's what you want to stand on. Otherwise it will be one of these great British Columbia bogs, and we don't want that, with plenty of methane coming out of them.
Well, the great news is that John is also an adjunct professor here at the School of Regional Planning. So if you have the opportunity, I would encourage you to engage with him at UBC. And the other good news is that Tim will be returning back here into our region next year, and comes not too irregularly, of course, to connect with families. So hopefully we'll have a chance to reconnect with him. And we have, of course, just right after now. So if you have any other questions, I'm sure that they'd be happy to speak with you. And I just want to say a big thank you for all of you. And we are on this journey together, this transition to sustainability. And I'd like you to join me. It's my pleasure to join me to thank both John and Tim Reardon for coming here and sharing their thoughts.